The fire is down to coals when the prairie finally goes quiet. Somewhere on the high plains of what will one day be called Nebraska, a line of wagons has folded itself into a loose circle. Oxen stand in the dark beyond the firelight, their shapes barely visible, backs turned to the wind. Inside the circle, the last tin plates clink. A baby fusses in one of the canvas-covered beds, and a fiddle is playing something that reminds people of home. This is one night on the Oregon Trail. Not the hurried version from a school textbook or an old computer game, but the slow 4 a.m. reality lived by hundreds of thousands of people who crossed roughly 2,000 miles from the Missouri River to Oregon City in the mid-1800s. As you listen, imagine yourself in that circle of wagons. The day's march is done, the trail is dark, and the only thing between this fragile camp and the emptiness around it is the night watch. The Oregon Trail was never just a line on a map. It was a season of life. For most emigrants, the journey began at a jumping-off place on the Missouri River, towns like Independence or St. Joseph, where streets were choked with wagons, livestock, spare wheels, barrels, and anxious families. They sold farms, closed up shops, and traded heavy furniture for sacks of flour and bacon, hoping they had guessed correctly about what was truly essential. If you stood by the river in the early 1850s, you might have watched train after train roll west, prairie schooners, lighter, smaller wagons rather than the gigantic Conestogas of Hollywood, pulled by mule teams or, more often, slow, patient oxen. Once a train left the river towns in April or May, it entered a new calendar. Instead of months and holidays, life was measured in miles and landmarks. The Platte River, Fort Laramie, Independence Rock, South Pass, Fort Hall, the Blue Mountains. If you reached Independence Rock in present-day Wyoming by the 4th of July, you were on schedule. If not, you worried about snow in the mountains and whether your cattle would still be alive when you reached Oregon. Every day on that road ended the same way, in a camp that had to survive until dawn. A typical day on the trail began in darkness. Historical accounts describe a routine that, once established, changed very little. Around 4 a.m., the wagon leader would sound a trumpet or fire a rifle to wake the camp. Men and older boys went out into the gray half-light to round up the animals that had been turned loose to graze during the night. Women and girls stirred coals back into life, put coffee on to boil, and started breakfast. By 6, teams were hitched. By 7, the wagon master's call, "Wagons, roll!" sent the train creaking forward. Most emigrants aim to travel between 10 and 15 miles in a day, a distance that sounds modest until you factor in river crossings, mud, bad roads, sick animals, and the constant possibility of something breaking. It usually took 4 to 6 months to make the full journey west. At midday, the train stopped for nooning, an hour's rest, a simple meal, a chance to check wheels and axles. Then, back on the road until late afternoon, when the captain and scouts picked a spot with water, grass, and at least some shelter from the wind. Only then did night begin to take shape. If you picture a wagon train camping, you probably picture a perfect defensive circle, rifles bristling from behind the wheels, everybody waiting for an attack at any moment. The reality was more practical and less theatrical. By about 6 in the evening, the wagons would pull into a rough circle or sometimes a U-shape, leaving a gap to drive livestock in and out. Contemporary descriptions make it clear this was more about managing animals and weather than preparing for battle. The circle made a makeshift corral, kept oxen and mules from wandering off in the dark, and gave some shelter from wind and storms that rolled across the open plains. The animals were unyoked or unharnessed and driven to water and grass if there was any. Fires were lit using whatever fuel the land provided, wood where it was available, buffalo chips on treeless stretches. Supper was often simple, some combination of bacon, bread or biscuits, beans, and whatever fresh meat could be hunted or traded for. While the food cooked, the camp went to work. Wheels were tightened, axles greased, broken harness repaired, shoes mended. Women and older girls might set up a wash tub to do laundry if the water source allowed it. Children were given chores, gathering chips, fetching water, minding younger siblings, and then, if there was any time left, allowed to play. In the evening, when the immediate work was done, the frontier version of leisure appeared. Diaries talk about emigrants playing cards, chess, or checkers, about fiddles, flutes, and sometimes even small pianos brought along from home. People wrote letters to be sent from the next fort, mended clothes by firelight, and told stories. But behind all that daily bustle was the quiet knowledge that someone had to stay awake. The night watch was not a romantic idea. It was simply necessary. A camp full of exhausted people, with teams of valuable animals grazing or picketed nearby, and wagons laden with everything a family owned. That was a tempting target for thieves of any kind, human or four-legged. It was also a delicate system that could unravel in minutes if a herd stampeded in the dark. Some wagon trains were formal about their watches. They elected a captain and wrote down rules. Others were looser, little more than a cluster of neighboring families moving in the same direction and improvising as they went. But in both cases, the job of watching the camp at night had to be shared. One 19th century description of a trail schedule notes that by around 8 in the evening, camp quieted down and guards went on duty. Around midnight, those guards were relieved by a second shift. In the small hours of the morning, sometime before 4 a.m., the last guard might rouse the wagon leader to prepare for another day. The people taking those shifts were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, carpenters. Many had never handled firearms regularly before they bought rifles or pistols for protection. Before leaving home, misfires and accidents from unfamiliar weapons caused injuries and deaths all along the trail. On watch, a man might walk slowly around the perimeter of the camp, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't belong, for the panicked snort of an animal about to bolt, for voices where there should have only been snores. On moonless nights, he navigated by memory and silhouette, the shape of each wagon, the looming bulk of a nearby hill, the faint glimmer of the river. Plenty of nights were uneventful, but every emigrant knew that all it took was one bad night. The dangers after dark were real, but not always the ones people expected. From the distance of 2 centuries, it's easy to imagine every wagon train besieged by constant attacks from Native American warriors. The numbers tell a different story. Research by the National Historic Oregon Trail Interpretive Center estimates that between 1840 and 1860, Native Americans killed 362 emigrants, and emigrants killed 426 Native people along the trail. Most of these deaths occurred west of South Pass, and when you compare them to the huge number of people traveling, hundreds of thousands, they were a small fraction of the total. Most tribes tolerated the wagon trains passing through their homelands. Many emigrants survived only because they could trade for food, horses, or local knowledge. Misunderstandings and conflicts certainly happened, including thefts and raids, but all-out attacks on large organized trains were rare. The more constant enemies after dark were quieter. Stampedes could destroy a journey in a single night. A thunderstorm, a sudden gust of wind, a predator moving too close to nervous cattle. Any of these could send oxen or mules crashing through camp, tearing loose from picket lines or yokes, wagons jarring, people scrambling out of the way. When teams scattered, it might take days to round them up again, if they were found at all. Weather was another relentless threat. Diaries speak of nights with choking dust, nights of cold rain that soaked everything and everyone, nights of howling wind on the open plains, nights in mosquito-ridden river bottoms where animals and humans alike were tormented until morning. And then there was disease, the invisible danger that killed more emigrants than anything else on the trail. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, illnesses driven by contaminated water and poor sanitation, turned wagons into rolling infirmaries and made every night a vigil over the sick. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 10 emigrants who set out died before reaching their destination, with disease accounting for a large share of those deaths. If you were on night watch, You listen not just for hoofbeats and distant howls, but for the coughing inside the wagons, for moans, for the sound of someone climbing down to check on a child. Some of the best glimpses we have of the night watch come from people who did it. Decades after his own journey in 1852, Oregon pioneer Ezra Meeker wrote about what he called the most trying part of the whole trip, the all-night watches over the cattle. In his account, he describes how he and others would make the herd their bedfellows, lying down back to back with the animals for warmth and as a living alarm system. If the ox got up suddenly, so did the man over time, he said. They grew used to sleeping in snatches, except when a storm made sleep impossible. Picture that arrangement in your mind. The prairie is wide and dark. There's no fence, no barn, no stable, just a cluster of shapes on the grass. A man in rough trail clothes lies with his back pressed against the side of an ox, the animal's warmth soaking through his coat. His rifle is nearby, but not in his hands. In the distance, he can see the faint glow of the wagon camp's fire. When the ox shifts, he half wakes, looks around, listens, then drifts back toward sleep. This wasn't the kind of watch you could keep at perfect attention for 8 straight hours. It was a compromise. A little sleep, a little awareness, enough presence of mind to respond when something went wrong. It was also shared. Men rotated duties, taking their turn to stay up later or wake earlier, because everyone knew that fatigue could be as dangerous as any raider. On some stretches of trail, especially where grass was scarce near the road, the animals had to be taken miles away from camp to find adequate forage. In those cases, the watchman might spend the entire night far from the wagons. In the morning, if everything went well, they drove the herd back toward the rising sun and the waiting train. If it did not go well, the entire day that followed would be consumed with the consequences. As the hour grows late, life inside the wagon circle follows its own ritual. Children, who at first found the novelty of camping in a wagon thrilling, now fall asleep quickly from sheer exhaustion. Their beds might be tick mattresses or piles of blankets laid over stored goods. Canvas creaks faintly overhead in the night breeze. Somewhere close by, a parent reaches out every so often to feel a child's forehead, checking that a fever hasn't worsened. Outside, the last conversation fades. Someone finishes a whispered prayer. Someone else pokes the fire one more time, then lets it die down to avoid wasting fuel. A few embers keep a kettle of water warm for the guards. By 8 or 9, the camp is settled. Guards move into their positions, one by the gap in the wagon circle, one near the animals, perhaps another posted a little way off where the ground rises and the view is good. The sounds of the camp merge into a steady backdrop, soft snoring, the clink of a chain, the rumble of an ox shifting its weight. Above, the sky is vast for many emigrants. This was their first extended encounter with the unbroken night of the interior West. Dark so deep it felt like a substance, stars in numbers, that outmatched any sky east of the Mississippi. For some, this was a comfort. For others, it was a reminder of how far they were from everything familiar. The guard paces, stops, listens. The creak of a wagon, the distant yip of a coyote, the soft splash of a river nearby. All of it becomes part of the mental map of the night. Sometimes there were visitors in the dark, not the dramatic raids of fiction, but small groups. Local native people approaching cautiously to trade food or horses, or simply to observe the strange mobile towns that moved across their homeland. Many emigrant journals record nighttime encounters where wary guards were surprised to find people offering salmon, berries, or guidance in exchange for cloth, tools, or tobacco. These meetings could be tense. Neither side knew exactly what the other intended. A guard might wake the wagon master, who in turn roused a few more men, weapons nearby but not necessarily visible. A circle of light around the dying fire, figures beyond it, partly illuminated, gestures trying to bridge gaps in language and trust. Other nights, the visitors were less welcome. Swarms of mosquitoes along a riverbank, driving horses nearly mad, wolves drawn by the smell of offal left from butchering. curious bears in the mountain country, though outright attacks were rare. And then there were storms. An evening that started clear could end with black clouds boiling over the horizon. Lightning flashed, turning wagons and animals into stark silhouettes. Thunder rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, tugging at canvas covers and making the wagons rock on their axles. In those moments, the camp was suddenly very small. The watch then was not about enemies. It was about keeping fires under control, making sure wagons didn't shift dangerously, and praying that no animal panicked and tried to bolt people huddled under canvas, listening to the rain drum on the wagon tops and wondering what the road would look like in the morning. And then, slowly, the night thinned. In the hours after midnight, the first set of guards would hand their duties over to the next. A man crawled out from under a blanket, pulled on his boots, and reached for his coat. Another handed him a few quiet words, where the animals were grazing, whether anything unusual had happened, how the weather was changing. Around that time, the camp often entered its deepest sleep. Even the sick might rest, however fitfully. The night seemed to stretch and soften. Every sound carried a little farther in the cold air. A distant owl, a splash in the river, a cough inside a wagon. By 3 or 4 in the morning, some watches felt endless. The guard might focus his eyes on the faint glow of the horizon or the brightest star on the eastern side of the sky. Willing it to move faster, fatigue pulled at him. The temptation to sit and close his eyes grew stronger. Yet the knowledge persisted. If he let the fire go out entirely, cooking breakfast would be that much harder. If he nodded off and a picket rope snapped, the train might spend the day chasing animals instead of making miles. Finally, near 4, the sky in the east gained the slightest hint of color. The last guard moved through camp, touching wagon wheels, calling softly to the wagon master or captain. It was time to wake. The same signal that had closed out the previous day's journey, rifle shot or trumpet, shout or simple word of mouth, now opened the next. Inside the wagons, people stirred. Fires were coaxed from coals, coffee was brewed. The animals who had grazed or dozed their way through the night were rounded up, hitched, and coaxed once more into motion. The camp dissolved, leaving ash, trampled grass, and sometimes a fresh grave, because death did not keep regular hours on the trail. Then the long line of wagons creaked forward, leaving the night's worries behind them and heading toward whatever waited over the horizon. When you step back and think about it, the Oregon Trail was made not just of spectacular struggles at river crossings or dramatic moments at mountain passes, but of thousands upon thousands of ordinary nights like this, nights when nothing obvious happened, but people still did what needed to be done. They shared out the watch in the same way they shared out the work of yoking cattle, chopping wood, cooking meals, and caring for children and the sick. They adapted to routines that would have seemed harsh and alien back home. All-night vigils with cattle as bedmates, storm-tossed camps on open grasslands, mosquito-haunted bivouacs along muddy riverbanks. Most of the emigrants were not adventurers in the romantic sense. They were people who wanted land, or a better climate, or a chance to start over after economic failures or family losses. They had heard stories, some true, some wildly exaggerated, about fertile valleys in Oregon's Willamette Valley, about rich soil and mild rains and forests full of timber. Between those dreams and their reality stood the trail, 5 or 6 months long, and every single night on it. The statistics, 2,000 miles, 4 to 6 months, roughly 1 in 10 dying along the way, can make the Oregon Trail feel abstract. But when you zoom into a single camp, a single watch, a single sleepless man pacing between wagons under a cold sky, the journey becomes personal again. He is looking after his own family, yes. He's also looking after neighbors who, weeks before, might have been strangers. He's listening to the same coyotes, watching the same stars, feeling the same wind as hundreds of other guards in hundreds of other camps strung out along that vast corridor from Missouri to Oregon. If you could see it all at once, from above in a night without clouds, you'd see a scattered constellation across the dark land. tiny clusters of firelight and canvas, each one surrounded by darkness, each one holding its own little world of hope, fear, and determination. The sun rises, the fires die, the wagons roll on. But for a few hours in between the last light of one day and the first light of the next, the future of every family on the Oregon Trail depended on people who stayed awake while others slept, listening to the deep, quiet breathing of the animals, the whisper of the wind over the grass, and the distant promise of a new home waiting somewhere beyond the edge of the dark.